Hey guys, welcome to the first lesson in our Unity tutorial series. Unity is a really great game engine because it's super easy to learn, yet you can make really professional games and even polish them on platforms such as Steam. It's recommended that you know a little bit of coding before beginning, but if you would like to just jump right in, I'll be explaining the concepts as I go, so you should be fine. Alright, so before we start, we're going to need to install Unity. However, there's already a ton of videos out there and the process is pretty self-explanatory, so I'll just put a link to the videos and the website in the description, and go ahead and just pause the video now and download it if you haven't already. Alright, so hopefully you've downloaded it and we can move on. So once you have it loaded up after you've downloaded it, I'm going to go ahead and just hit new, and we'll create a new project. So make sure 3D is selected because we're going to work with 3D for now, just because it's easy to understand the concepts this way. Go ahead and give it a project name. I'm just going to call this tutorial project 1. Alright, and then select the location. Go ahead and hit create. Okay, cool. So once it's done, it should look something like this. So there's a lot of windows here. It might look a little bit confusing at first, but I'm going to walk through each one. So the first thing we have is on the left here, we have the hierarchy. And all this is basically it's just going to display all of the objects that are in your scene, right? If you can't see all of them, you'll be able to see them here. Right, so right now all we have is the camera. If I click on it, it selects it. And the light, if I click on it, it also selects that. The next thing we're going to talk about is the scene. So this is the main thing. This is what the players are going to be looking at, what they're going to be playing in whenever you run it. Actually, what they see is here in the game. But scene is going to be where you can edit everything. This is where you can move objects around, create your map, do all kinds of stuff. This is where all the magic happens, if you will. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about moving around in a second once I talk about all the other windows. Next thing on the right here is we have the inspector. So what this is when you select an object, let's say the camera, here you have all of these options to do adjustments. Right, we can change the position, rotation, scale. We also have some specific things like light, camera, let's go here. Right, we have camera options. And then we have the option to add a component, which I'm going to talk about later on when we're actually coding. Last thing we're going to talk about here with the windows is the project. This is where you can see all of your files. Right now we don't have any except for the scene, right? But if you create something, let's say we're using images, creating prefabs, which I'll explain in a later lesson probably, they're all going to appear here. So just know that's where your files are. Alright, so how do we move around in the scene? Because this is one of the most important things to learn as a beginner. I'm going to explain. So the first thing is panning around. So what that means is moving just like this, right? Moving on a single plane. So there's a couple ways you can do this. Well, actually 2 ways you can do this. The first way is clicking the middle mouse button, holding it down, and you can drag around. The other way is pressing Q, and then you can left click and drag around. Alright, the next thing I'm going to talk about is orbiting. So orbiting is basically just spinning around on a certain point. So if I click down Alt, the way we do this is Alt, hold it down, and then just left click and drag across the screen. So this is how you can look around like that. Right, if you want to quickly look to the other side of the object, this is really helpful. Next thing is zooming, and zooming is actually pretty self-explanatory. It's just the scroll wheel, scroll in to zoom in, scroll out to zoom out. Right, pretty easy, pretty simple stuff. Next thing, second to last thing, is fly through. So what this is kind of like a first person sort of view, first person kind of control. What it is if you hold down right click, you're going to be able to look around as if you were playing something like Minecraft or CSGO or some kind of first person shooter. And you can also move around while holding down the right click with WASD. So this isn't super useful, but sometimes if you want to see what it's like being a player, something like that can be helpful to know. Last thing is just centering. So if we select an object, let's say the light, zoom out, press F, it's going to bring us into focus. Same for the camera. The other way you can do this is if you select the object here and you double click, it'll bring you into focus. Alright, so that's all you need to know for now about navigating around the scene. Now let's talk about adding objects. How do we add an object? The way we do this is in the hierarchy. We're going to go to the left here. We're going to right click. We're going to say 3D object since we're dealing in 3D. And it has all kinds of shapes that we can just create. Now, these are all pre-made and you can adjust them how you want. For now, we're just going to deal with cube because it's easy. So we have a cube now. And you'll notice that once it's selected, we have these arrows coming out of it. And that's how we can move it. So now we're going to talk about transforming. The first thing is movement, so position basically. And if we click on any of these arrows, we can drag it up and down, left and right, back and forth, right? And you'll notice that each of these is differently colored, and that's because they correspond with these three axes, X, Y, and Z. And you'll also notice that when we click on this and we drag it, it only moves in that one direction. So for example, if I click Y, I won't be able to move it back and forth. It's only going up and down. So that can be a little bit annoying at times, but it's really helpful if you want to be precise. If you want to move it around freely, if you look at these little squares right there, if you click on one of those, we'll be able to move it. Alright, next thing is rotation. So if you go up here in the upper left hand corner, you see all of these different tools. Rotation is going to be the one with two arrows, kind of in a circle. You notice that our arrows change into like a circle thing. But again, we have three colored just like our axes. And when you click on each one, you're just rotating it along that axis. So pretty self-explanatory. This is just rotating around, as the name suggests. If you take a look at the inspector on the right, you can also see that these numbers change whenever you adjust them. You can also change them here. So if I want to reset the position back to the original, I just set each one to 0. It's back to original. And same thing for rotation. I'm just going to say 0, 0, 0. So we just reset our cube. Cool. Last thing is going to be scaling. Scaling is basically just stretching it out. So again, three axes. You can stretch it out along the Z, stretch it out along the Y, and same thing for X. Right, so now we have a really big rectangular thing. I'm just going to reset it for now because we don't want that. Alright, so we've talked about moving around in the scene, we've talked about creating an object and changing the transform. Now let's actually do something. So we're going to create some really simple movement code and allow the user to control a cube, allow it to roll around, that kind of stuff. So let me just save real quick. Oops, where's my cube? Alright, it's being a little bit weird. I'm just going to delete it and create a new one. Cube. Okay, there we go. So this cube is going to serve as our ground. So I could scale it down like that and then drag it out. But since I like being precise, I'm going to change it here in the inspector. So I just want it to be 25 along the X, 0.5 along the Y, so it's a little bit thinner, and then 25 along the Z. So we have this nice big plane right here. Cool, this is going to be our ground. And actually, before I do anything else, I'm just going to rename this cube to be ground, just so we stay nice and organized. We don't want to have a bunch of things named cube throughout the project, especially once it gets a lot larger. Right, that can definitely become really confusing. Alright, next thing we're going to do is we're going to create another cube to serve as our player. So again, in the hierarchy, just right click, 3D object, cube, and we see that it appears right here. Actually, it's not in the center, so we're going to go ahead and center it. And we'll change back to move mode and bring it up a little bit. Alright, so if we go back to game, and then if we hit run, let's just see what happens. Well, nothing happened. That's because we haven't given the cube any physics. It doesn't have any gravity or anything like that. So how do we do that? Because that sounds kind of complicated, right? You have to code in order to get it to move, right? In order to have it gravity. But Unity actually makes it really simple. We can get this cube to fall to the ground without writing a single line of code. All I have to do is click on it, and then in here in the inspector, we see on the bottom the add component button I was talking about earlier. Click on that. We see that we have all of these things here. And if we click on one, you see there's all kinds of stuff. So what are these things? This is kind of like snippets of code that do certain things that Unity has already provided for you. So we're going to be creating our own components or scripts later on. But here we see that there's a lot of stuff that's already been done for us. So we just have to use it. What we're going to use is something called Rigidbody. So go ahead and type that in. Make sure you select the one that says Rigidbody, not Rigidbody 2D. Click on that. And we should have something here. And make sure use gravity is checked. Now if you run it, hit the little play button, you see that falls to the ground. Right? We don't have to do anything except add a component, but now we have physics. So that's pretty cool. Now, how do we get this cube to actually move back and forth, left and right, whenever the user presses a button? To do that, now we actually have to start writing code. So we're going to go down here in the bottom, in our project section, we're going to right click, We're going to go to create, and we're going to create a C# script. And we'll say basic movement. All right, so I didn't talk about this earlier, but the way we're going to be coding scripts in Unity is through C#. If you've done Java before, the syntax and everything is basically the same. If you did something like Python, or maybe you haven't coded before, I'll try to explain it a little bit so you can learn as we go. But yeah, it shouldn't be too difficult. Alright, so once you open up the file, it should open up in Visual Studio or whatever editor you're using, and we'll see that we have a void start method and a void update method already created. So what do these do? Well, they have comments up here explaining them, and they're actually pretty helpful. Start is called once before the first start frame. So what that means is the second you hit the play button, it's going to run the code inside of start. Update, on the other hand, is called once per frame. So this means as the game is running, right, it's going to constantly call this again and again and again and again, right? It's just going to keep going on and on as long as this object exists, right? So if you want something to happen once, if it's setup code, that kind of stuff, put in start. If you want it to happen again and again, right, if we want to keep checking to see if the user is pressing a button, or if you want something to just keep going straight, we would put it inside of update. All right, so how do we get this cube here to move in the direction? The way we do that is with the rigid body component that we just added. The way we're going to move is we're going to have this rigid body. It's going to add a force in whatever direction we want to move. For example, if I press W, we want the cube to move forward, so it's going to add a force in this direction. If I press A, we want the cube to move left, so we're going to add a force in this direction. Same for back and right. So how do we do that? Let's go back to our code. The first thing we want to do is outside of the start and update method, we're just going to create a variable. Say rigid body RB. All right, so this variable is what we're going to use to basically connect with this component that's on here. Right, so it's going to get access to this rigid body, and then it's going to tell it what to do. So how do we do that? In the start method, we're just going to say RB, RB equals get component rigid body, and then parentheses. All right, so what is this doing? It looks a little bit complicated. So I'll just break it down. What this is saying is once the script is attached to an object, it's going to get component. It's basically just going to check to see if there's an object of the type that's in between here. So what type is it looking for? It's looking for a rigid body. So if it has a rigid body, RB is going to be equal to rigid body, and it's going to be storing that. Otherwise, if it doesn't have a rigid body, it'll just end up with an error. All right, cool. One more thing before we move on. Let's add a speed variable. So let's say public float speed equals 5.0 f. Let's say 10.0 f. This is basically just going to control how fast the cube is moving, and we'll use it later on. One thing I do want to point out though is that we use public here, right? And let me explain what that does. So let's go ahead and add our script as a component. There's two ways we can do this. We can do add component and type in the script name, so basic movement, or we can just drag it. So drag it right here. Right here. All right, so you'll notice that we have this option to change the speed in here. Right, we can change it to 5. Let's change it back to 5. But we're able to change it here. That's basically what public means. If this wasn't public, then you wouldn't be able to change it in the inspector. If it is public, like we have right now, you can change it. So basically, if you have something that you want to easily change, right, you want to just access it through the inspector, go ahead and set it to public, right? It's just a lot easier that way if you want to change it a lot. All right, so what we're going to do in update, we just want to have this cube continuously go forward. So all I have to do is say RB, add force. Right, so we're telling it to push it. Now we have to give it a direction. So let's just say vector3 dot forward times speed. All right, so if you don't know what a vector is or vector3 is, don't worry about it too much for now. Just know that vectors are basically giving it a direction, right? And when we say vector3 dot forward, we're just telling it the forward direction. Then we're multiplying it by speed because we want to, give it a certain amount of force in that direction. And that's what speed is. So if we save this and then hit run, let's see what happens. So we see that this cube is going off, on and on and on, all the way into the distance. So we can't see anymore, but it's still rolling. And that's because update is always called. So it looks like that's working. Okay, the last thing we're going to do for this video is we're going to set it up so that when the user presses that button, it's going to go in a different direction. So let's go ahead and cut this, and we're going to check to see if the user presses W. Then the cube's going to go forward. So we're going to say if, and we're going to say input.getKey keycode.w. Right? All this is doing is saying, is the user pressing W? If that's true, right? If the user is pressing W, we're going to execute the code here. And that's just going to be rb.addForce, whatever we had earlier. Next thing we're going to check to see if the user is pressing down A. So we're going to say input.getKey keycode.A. In that case, we're going to do rb.addForce again, but instead of saying vector3.forward, we're going to say vector3.left times speed. Right? Hopefully you get the point. So now I'm just going to copy this, copy paste. All we have to do is change it to be backwards. So S instead of forward, it's going to be back. Same thing for the last one. Instead of A, it's going to be D. Instead of left, it's going to be right. Now if we save it, go back to Unity, wait for it to load, hit the play button. We see that nothing happens so far. But if I press W, see the cube starting to roll. Press S, it's moving left. If I press D, it's going to the right. A is going to the left. So it looks like it's working exactly like we want it to. And we successfully set up a movement script. So I know that's nothing super impressive, but hopefully you guys understand Unity a little bit better, right? The basic navigations, how it's set up, and just how creating a script works. So next time we're going to be going a little bit more in depth on using scripts, and we'll be taking a look at some other components. All right, see you guys next time.